So we, of course, look at the American politics, and we enjoy very much what's going on there, because it's always nice to look at someone else's backyard. But now we want to give our friends in the United States a closer look on the Israeli politics. And as we all know, it's going to be the fourth election in the last 2 years. And I guess the main question, again, beside the corona and the economic situation, is yes or no Netanyahu. And he's has a challenge now from right-wing parties too. So can you brief us a bit about the political situation now and what we are expected to see in the upcoming election?
Well, we have, as we often have in Israel, we have a very fractured political field, a lot of new parties coming from both the right and the left, and interesting challenges to Netanyahu, because what's different at this point is, I think, that the challenges that are coming from the right. We're used to, at least in the last, since 2013, more or less, maybe even before that, more and more parties on the left or the center left sort of fracturing, saying that they'll be the alternative to Netanyahu and challenging him from the left. And that has made it easier for Netanyahu to sort of rally his right-wing base behind him and say, if you don't vote for Likud, you don't vote for me, we could have another Oslo, or we could end up with some kind of major concessions to the Palestinians. You don't want that. Vote for me for Israel's security, etc. But now we have some serious challenges on the right. There's Naftali Bennett and the Yamina party, and then there's Gideon Sa'ar and his party that is called New Hope for Star Wars fans, or for people who like to go antiquing in Pennsylvania. It's a nice party name. In any case, Gideon Sa'ar is a former minister from Likud. He was interior minister. He was a very popular education minister in Israel, and was a very talented politician, I would say. That as a Knesset member, as the party sort of whip, he was known to have been very good at political negotiating and getting things done, and is an effective minister as well. And fairly popular in Likud, although a year ago he ran against Netanyahu to be Likud leader, and he got less than a third of the vote, which he didn't really think he would win, but he was hoping that a third would be sort of a respectable amount. In any case, Sa'ar has sort of set himself up as the alternative, or as the person who was going to come instead after Netanyahu as leader of Likud for about 5 years already. And as such, Netanyahu has not liked him very much and has not really allowed him to continue to progress sort of and move up the ranks in Likud. Didn't appoint Sa'ar as a minister in his government this time. And Sa'ar, in the meantime, seemed to really be holding back on further sort of criticizing Netanyahu, especially on issues of, when it comes to Netanyahu's corruption cases and his investigations. And then, and Sa'ar maintains that Netanyahu is innocent until proven guilty, but Netanyahu's sort of general behavior around that issue, comments that he's made that have been seen as sort of undermining the rule of law, the police, the state attorney's office. So Sa'ar is sort of carefully threading this needle, because policy-wise, he's almost identical to Likud. But on the other hand, he has a criticism of Likud, which Naftali Bennett, who I'll also discuss, has, which is that Likud has sort of become a one-man party, that it's not the sort of open forum for discussion that it used to be. It's just sort of whatever serves Netanyahu, whatever will keep Netanyahu out of jail, is what Likud does. And so he's sort of leveled this criticism quite openly. Now that he's formed a new party, he has another Likud minister, Zev behind him, and a few other Knesset members from Likud, and so he is running for Knesset. Now, the other challenge to the right is Naftali Bennett. Naftali Bennett is the former chief of staff for Netanyahu, and Netanyahu's opposition leader. And Netanyahu had a falling out. That sort of job ended badly, and he became the head of basically the latest incarnation of the National Religious Party. Now, Bennett is, I would say, to the right of Netanyahu. He, Netanyahu fully embraced the Trump peace plan, for example, and Netanyahu criticized the fact that it would allow for the formation of a Palestinian state, even if that state would be demilitarized and not contiguous. He's not for any kind of concessions of land, for example. Bennett also has this issue that he comes from the religious right, both personally and politically. He comes from the religious right, and so many times he's sort of discounted as not mainstream enough. And you see this in election after election, that he actually polls really well in the beginning of elections because he says a lot of things that people like. Even if it's not necessarily his sort of uncompromising position on the Palestinian issue, social things, economic things, he's very economically liberal, for example. Those things really appeal to people. And right now he's really appealing to people with his sort of criticism of how the government is handling coronavirus. He has alternative plans. He even published a book a few months ago with his plan. But when it comes to the actual election himself, the election itself, he almost always chokes. He almost always does significantly worse than how he polled. So much so that the first election of this 4-election cycle, he didn't even pass the electoral threshold. He just missed it by 2,000 seats. That was also partially because he had sort of broken off from Bayit Yehudi and split up the national religious vote between two parties. But it's just an example of how he can poll really well. And then so far, since he first entered politics for the 2013 election, he always does worse. So if we're talking about people sort of vying to take Netanyahu's place on the right, I think Saar is the more serious threat. And so Netanyahu is sort of dealing with something, I wouldn't say that it's wholly new. I think that, this already happened in the early 1990s, and it ended up with Yitzhak Rabin getting elected prime minister. I think the chance that a left-wing candidate will become prime minister in this election is very slim. Just looking at the numbers at the moment and the candidates, but I think that there is a chance that Saar, I think his chances are better than Bennett, will be able to form some kind of coalition without Likud. And it would be a coalition with a broad range of political views, and it would probably include some from the left, maybe not far left, it depends how the numbers come out. But there's a greater chance now than I think there has been in a while. Whereas before it was sort of like the center-left candidate couldn't form a coalition, couldn't get a majority without Netanyahu, and therefore could only do a unity government like we just had, which was totally dysfunctional. Now there might be a slight chance.
Thank you very much, Lahav. We are going to have our conversation for a few more minutes, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. I ask you all to write your questions on the chat box on the right hand side, and our staff will take it and try to let you speak or to ask your questions. Lahav, so who is going to be the next prime minister by chances? I know it's hard to bet here; it's very close. But I guess we have Netanyahu, Saar, Lapid, and Bennett. These are the 4 candidates. Lahav, start again.
No, in the Talmud it says that in our. Oh no! Seriously? Just a second.
No, you are fine. You are fine. You are fine. Lahav,
I'm fine.
Yes. We see you.
Now my video's up. Okay, good. Wonderful. Okay, so the Talmud says that in our times, prophecy is only given to fools. So I'm not going to say I don't know who the next prime minister will be. I think Netanyahu has a very good chance of continuing. He manages to pull off political feats that no one ever guessed he could pull off. But I think that Saar is a real challenge because he's sort of able to bring together coalitions that Netanyahu is not able to bring together.
Okay, so how many let's say ideas Netanyahu can come up with till the election? We saw before the previous 3 consecutive elections in the last 2 years, that he managed to have all kind of international meetings, international summits. So now he's going to focus on the vaccinations, on Morocco.
Well, yeah, I think first of all, as long as the vaccine operation keeps going well, I think that's going to be a huge thing, you know, that like, you know, I am the leader in the world who was able to pull our country out first. It's just a very sort of low-hanging fruit for a campaign. And I think the Israelis are very proud and are very happy to be vaccinated overall. I will say, I don't want to jinx it, but you know, our coronavirus response was really good also at the beginning of last year, you know, March, April, May. And then when we came out, it became bad again. I mean, it became bad for a lot of people, not just, you know, not just Israel. So you can't say that this is like something uniquely bad about Netanyahu, but I hope our vaccine rollout continues to be so efficient and so wonderful, but I don't know, because I hear we're running out of vaccines at the moment. As it stands, that is a good message that Netanyahu can definitely use, and I think it'll work for him very well. Another thing he's doing, which I think has surprised a lot of people, is that Netanyahu is now seeking to campaign in the Israeli Arab population. His campaign managers and his pollsters think that he can get another 2 to 3 seats from Israeli Arabs by campaigning on the Abraham Accords. The Joint List, which is the main bloc of Arab political parties, they voted against the Abraham Accords, but the Accords and you know, relations with more Arab countries is extremely popular among Arab citizens of Israel. And so they feel to some extent betrayed. And the fact is that over the years, the Joint List and, you know, the parties that made up the Joint List overwhelmingly focus on Palestinian issues and not as much on domestic Arab issues. And they're a constituency that has real needs. Now, some people are saying, you know, Netanyahu said that he was going to appoint or work on a policy to fight the high level of crime and also illegal weapons in the Israeli Arab communities. And people said, you know, you've been prime minister now for 11 consecutive years. Where have you been all this time? Why did you suddenly remember it now? So it remains to be seen if that will work in a campaign or not. His campaign is talking seriously about appointing an Israeli Arab candidate to the Likud list, which will also be interesting. Up until now, they're sort of not Jewish candidates, have always been Druze. Now they might have both. So that's definitely something to watch as part of the campaign. And I think the Abraham Accords appeals not only to Israeli Arabs. I think that Netanyahu is going to keep pushing that point. I think he's going to try to get either to fly abroad to visit some of the countries that Israel now has peace with, or he's going to try to get leaders to come to Israel. There's some talk of trying to convince the King of Morocco to come in the next few months. However, I do think that these leaders are smart enough to realize that there's a campaign going on, and they might not want to come before the election.
So now you have a background of the United States, right? You came to Israel from the United States. So with the understanding, of course, of what's going on now with the changing of administration in the US and all the other changes, how do you see the relations between Israel and the US after the election in Israel?
You know, it's complicated because I think we've never seen anything like President Trump in many, many ways, but also in the US-Israel relationship. You know, no daylight, extremely close, Netanyahu and Trump was really willing to put forward US policies that were, you know, it was like he looked at Netanyahu's wish list and was just checking things off the list. You know, that was really how Trump's policies often felt. He was really in sync with the Israeli right, or at least the Israeli moderate right. You know, and there was harmony for the past 4 years. Now, Biden is pro-Israel, and I don't want anyone to sort of get that wrong. He calls himself a Zionist. He has had great things to say about Israel for, you know, in his many decades of public service, but he is pro-Israel in the more traditional vein. He's very, very critical of the communities in Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the settlements. And we're going to go back to sort of what was normal when it comes to those things. And I think we're going to hear more criticism on those things and more pressure to return to the table with the Palestinians. But at the same time, I think that the commitment to Israel's security, defense cooperation and other areas like that are not going to change. And people talked about the Abraham Accords. It's hard to determine exactly what will happen. I think, Biden and his foreign policy team have said very positive things about the Abraham Accords. So I think they're in favor of more normalizations. The question is whether they're really willing to put the pressure on those countries the way the Trump administration did. And I'm less sure that they're going to make that a priority.
Thank you. I have a question here from a journalist in Poland who joined us here from TVN24, Jacek Tacik, and he asked, is Netanyahu has an opposition within the Likud party?
So Netanyahu did have an opposition within the Likud party, and that was Gideon Sa'ar and a handful of other people, but they've now left Likud because they say that Likud has been sort of corrupted in a sense, that Likud has turned into a one-man party and that it's not a party that allows people to oppose Netanyahu to debate, what Netanyahu wants and what his policies are. At this point, I think that he is mostly right in the sense that Likud used to be a party with a very sort of vibrant party institutions that would hold a lot of meetings and debates and things like that. And overall, the trend in Israel really is just that like party institutions are not so strong anymore. But I do think that anybody who doesn't agree with Netanyahu on anything, those motions they're just not going to pass in Likud. Now, Sa'ar is starting a party without primaries or things like that. So arguably anything Sa'ar wants is going to pass in his party as well, but we'll have to see sort of longer term what kind of institutions he decides to build for his party, or whether his party is just temporary until Netanyahu is out of office and then he tries to merge it back into Likud and take over, which is possible.
I see questions here from Mark Jacob about the Haredim in the coalition of Netanyahu, and also from Russell Schwartz about changing of prime minister, how politics in Israel will look like. So let's try to talk about the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox parties at the beginning. Will they keep being part of the coalition of Netanyahu, or there is any chance that they're going to leave him?
I think at the end of the day, the Haredim parties are going to do what they think is good for them and their constituents. And so far, for decades now, really, it has been to their advantage to stick with Likud, because the main opponents of Likud have been people who wanted sort of greater separation between religion and state, less funding for the ultra-Orthodox institutions and things like that. If the main contender against Netanyahu is Gideon Sa'ar, then they sort of have two people vying to be prime minister who are pretty pro-religious. Sa'ar personally is very traditionally sort of made a religious journey in recent years where he became more observant. And politically, he has very good relations with the Haredi parties. He's not looking to separate religion and state the way the more center-left parties are. He's not looking to push the envelope too much when it comes to Haredi enlistment in the IDF. And so I think at the moment they're remaining loyal to Netanyahu, but I think that it is a bit up in the air depending on the election results. I wouldn't assume that they are in Netanyahu's pocket.